Welcome, and thank you for joining me tonight for another peaceful story from long ago. As the world outside continues to grow still, I invite you to slow down and settle in for a gentle journey through the quieter corners of history. Tell me, if you'd like, where are you listening from? And what time is it right now? It's a lovely thought, all of us, scattered across time zones, sharing this moment together, the hollow crypt, how medieval bandits hid beneath churches it's late evening in the year 1328, and you are walking along the cobbled lane of a quiet village nestled in the low valleys of northern France. It smells faintly of damp stone, baking rye bread, and the smouldering end of a peat fire. As you pass the small church at the village center, modest in size but sturdy in form, you might not guess that beneath its stone floor lies more than the bones of saints and benefactors. In fact, on some chilly nights, it concealed something quite different. Bandits. Churches in the Middle Ages were not simply places of worship. They were multifunctional spaces, social centers, grain stores, schools, and, surprisingly often, places of refuge. But beneath them, especially in older stone churches built atop Roman foundations or in areas long settled, existed crypts, tunnels, cellars, and ossuary spaces, forgotten or purposefully hidden. These spaces were sometimes co-opted by those who needed to vanish. Not monks, not pilgrims, but criminals. Bandits in the 14th century were not always the swashbuckling rogues of legend. Many were displaced farmhands or former soldiers turned to theft out of starvation or opportunity. Others operated as semi-organized gangs, exploiting the collapse of feudal order during periods of war, plague, or local unrest. By the early 1300s, Western Europe, particularly France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Iberian Peninsula was a patchwork of contested land, roaming mercenaries, and poorly policed roads. Though kings ruled and sheriffs were appointed, much of rural life remained local, dependent on self-governing towns and church authority. In this space between centralized control and local order, banditry found fertile ground. So how does a medieval criminal end up beneath a church? Let's follow one such example reconstructed from court rolls, chroniclers, and monastic records. The small Norman village of Ypres. The Benedictine priory in Ypres was known for its ornate choir stalls and the elaborate crypt built beneath. It originally meant to house relics of St. Agnes, but by the time a ragged gang of displaced bowmen passed through in the 1330s, the crypt had become a disused chamber sealed behind an unassuming wooden door in the vestry. Local tradition whispered that the crypt was haunted, an idea likely encouraged by the monks. But a combination of good acoustics, a lazy sexton, and opportunistic timing meant that the space was eventually discovered by two brothers known only in the records as Jean and Baudry. These men weren't the literary outlaws of fiction. They didn't steal from the rich to give to the poor. They stole from merchants, hoarded flour, and sometimes disappeared for months at a time. Their discovery of the crypt came after a failed robbery in a neighboring village, bleeding from a shallow arrow wound and chased by angry peasants. The brothers ran not into the forest, as might be expected, but into the church. Why? Because churches were sanctuaries. They offered a legal concept in medieval canon law. Once inside a church, a criminal could not be forcibly removed for a period ranging from 30 to 40 days. But what if someone needed to stay hidden longer than that? According to a margin note from an Equi monk, sometime in the summer of 1332, noises like scraping and murmuring were heard in the floor beneath the apse. The note was vague, and no investigation was recorded. Local rumor interpreted it as the restless spirit of a wrongly executed relic thief. But in truth, the sounds likely came from Jean and Baudry who, finding the crypt accessible and unguarded, simply remained there. How did they survive? This is where the story becomes slower, more domestic, and quietly fascinating. Surviving underground in a damp crypt required more than stealth. The brothers had help. Not everyone in medieval villages hated outlaws. In fact, many villagers depended on them either as a form of resistance to unfair taxes or simply as fellow kin trying to get by. According to a later confession taken under duress from a local tanner's apprentice, food was left behind the old altar stone, and a bucket of fresh straw placed weekly. One monk even hinted that a young novice named Renaud may have been complicit, though no direct evidence links Renaud to the brothers. His sudden departure to another priory around the same time, cited as due to emotional instability and fear of ghosts, raises questions. The crypt, once used for storing bones and sacred relics, had become a hideout. Not just a place to sleep, but to live, at least for short stretches. Candles were likely used sparingly, for light was precious. Water may have been collected from a runoff channel nearby, waste most likely dumped discreetly at night through the back of the churchyard. What's striking is how mundane their existence was. While hiding beneath a church might seem dramatic, the brothers' daily life likely involved long hours of silence, stale bread, whispered plans, and uneasy sleep. It wasn't a life of daring raids, it was survival by stillness. Boring, damp, and tense. By winter, local records show a sudden increase in missing firewood and tools. Someone was sneaking out. But it would be another 8 months before the authorities began to suspect that the church's own foundation hid more than bones. And that's where we leave them for now. Two brothers beneath a Norman church, surviving quietly, night after night, with only the slow drip of rain through limestone to mark time. But how long can you hide beneath the holy place before someone notices? Discovery, denial, and the choir boy who knew the year is 1333. A quay is heavy with fog. The kind that clings low to the cobbled road and leaves a fine mist on stone walls and sheep alike. Beneath the little Benedictine church, Jean and Baudry are still alive, for nearly a year. The two brothers, former soldiers turned bandits, have survived beneath the vestry floor. Their secret crypt hideout, once home to forgotten relics, has become a refuge. But something has changed. Whispers in the village have grown louder. Chickens are going missing. A candle disappears from the altar. The scent of unfamiliar smoke is detected in the church, even when no monk has lit the THURIBL. It begins, as many such discoveries do, with a child. Thibaut, a choir boy of perhaps 10 winters, is the first to see the crack. A line along the stone where the vestry floor meets the wall, thin but changing, like a breath held and then released. One evening, when sent to clean candle wax from the altar rail, he hears something no louder than a cough, a whisper, a shuffling boot. He thinks it's a saint. Maybe Saint Agnes, displeased with how Father Renaud has been shortening the liturgy. But he doesn't tell anyone, not yet. Instead, the boy begins leaving crumbs, a bit of crust from supper, half an apple, a single plum. When he's feeling brave, it's part curiosity, part superstition. Then one day, the food is gone. Every time, meanwhile, Jean and Baudry's world is shrinking. The crypt, never warm, is now colder with the coming autumn. Their straw is damp. One of them develops a cough. Baudry, the younger, insists on risking the outside more often. He moves only at night, sometimes slipping out the back of the churchyard, sometimes entering the nave itself to steal bits of wax, a loose roll from the sacristy, or once, outrageously, a wedge of cheese from the kitchen table of the abbot's house. But these acts don't go unnoticed. Monk Bernard, responsible for tending to the church candles and the day's receipts of bread donations, notices the candle count is always just slightly off. One evening, he places a marked crust near the altar. In the morning, it is gone. No birds, no insects, just absence. He tells no one, but from that day on, he begins praying with a hand always on the crucifix around his neck. Soon after, a visiting canon from Rouen named Everard visits the priory. He is inspecting relic inventories, a dull affair by all measures. Yet, during his stay, he too notices something strange. On his second night, he sleeps in the sacristy and wakes at midnight to the sound of muffled steps. Not footsteps above or beside him, but below. He reports it with some embarrassment to Prior Matthew, who laughs it off. Old churches breathe, the prior says, especially in winter, but rumors now move faster than parchment. One boy says he saw a pale face at the foot of the altar. Another claims a monk told him the devil himself was hiding beneath the font. One woman, widowed, reclusive, and known for her dried herb teas, says she saw someone moving across the church roof at night. Baudry and Jean know their time is shortening, and yet they stay. Why? Perhaps because to leave would mean death. The forests are no safer now, filled with other displaced men and soldiers. The towns are watching for outlaws. And here beneath a holy place, they have at least managed not to freeze or starve. It is Thibaut, the coyer boy, who finally breaks the balance. One evening, when he returns to the altar steps with a heel of bread, he sees a face looking back. Through a crack in the wall jeans, unshaven and grave. The boy is not afraid. Instead, he says the words that seal their fate. Are you a saint or a sinner? Jean does not reply. The boy leaves the bread and does not come back the next day. But someone else does. A novice monk, one with duties in the vestry, returns in Thibaut's place. Sent after the boy told a tale that could no longer be ignored. That evening, 2 monks and a lay brother return to the vestry with torches. They knock on the floor, hollow. Then, they pry open a loose flagstone near the base of the altar and reveal the narrow steps to the crypt. No one descends that night, but word spreads quickly. The next morning, the sheriff of the district arrives. He is not amused. Iqui is not a large or influential place, and the last thing anyone needs is the bishop hearing that thieves have been nesting inside the house of God. When they descend at last into the crypt, it is empty, not entirely, though. A patch of old straw, the stub of a candle, a piece of chewed leather, but no Jean, no Baudry. The records don't say how they escaped. Some think they fled through a tunnel dug during the church's reconstruction decades earlier, long forgotten, and partially collapsed. Others suggest that one of the monks, perhaps the same young Renaud who had vanished suddenly before, had helped them flee. Afterward, the crypt was sealed with iron spikes. A ceremony was held. Incense was burned. Latin chants were sung with particular force, especially over the spot where the brothers had once slept. Thibaut, the boy, was told never to speak of it again, but he did. Years later, as an old man, he confessed the memory to a traveling scribe who recorded it as part of a local chronicle. That account, buried in dusty pages, untouched for centuries, was eventually found by a bored 19th century antiquarian, and now, you, And yet, one question remains. What became of Jean and Baudry? No bodies were ever found. No arrests recorded. No sightings confirmed. Did they simply vanish into another village, hide again, or did someone, somewhere, protect them until they died, old and anonymous? The afterlife of a hideout years have passed. It is now 1356, and the quiet Norman village of Equi has changed, though not dramatically. The church still stands. The fields still yield barley, slowly. The market is held on Wednesdays, and the peal of the bell still marks time. But beneath the church, the crypt that once sheltered the thieves is now spoken of only in whispers. No trace of Jean or Baudry ever reappeared in any official record, not in tax rolls, not in prison accounts, not even in execution registers. In medieval France, this is more than mysterious. It is nearly impossible. Most outlaws ended their careers on a rope or a pike. That the two brothers vanished completely suggests something else. Either they were very lucky or someone with influence chose to forget them. What we do know comes not from official history, but from the margins. In the 1370s, a monk at a nearby priory, writing a catalogue of saints' relics, included an offhanded note about a curious hermit who lived alone for decades in a ruined chapel to valleys east of Equi. This man, unnamed but described as familiar with weapons, fond of candle ends, and often silent, was said to have come from the north after some trouble with law or land. He died in peace, was buried without ceremony, and left behind nothing but a bundle of boiled leather straps and a single spoon made of horn dot. Could that have been Jean? Local memory had not entirely let go of the story. In village tales, passed from grandmother to grandson during long smoky winters, the brothers became something different. Not just criminals, but clever men, survivors, the sort who escaped sheriffs and found silence beneath the saints. Their stories softened, as such stories do with time, and yet the crypt itself, now sealed, continued to draw attention. In 1399, nearly 7 decades after the brothers' disappearance, a bishop from Rouen ordered the crypt to be reopened for inspection. He feared, as many did during that turbulent century, that ancient holy places might conceal heresy or worse, forgotten bones that should have been venerated. When masons pried up the floor, they found the space, much as it had been left, bare, damp, still, but there were new marks. Scratched initials on the wall, J and B, a faded cross, a crude drawing of a horse, barely visible, and, in one corner, a pile of straw so old it had fused into the stone. The bishop ordered the place sprinkled with holy water. Psalms were sung. The entrance was bricked up entirely this time. No more hidden doors. But history, unlike bricks, is harder to seal in the 17th century. A local antiquarian named Father Louis Marie wrote a private commentary on Norman village life in the Middle Ages. Among his footnotes, he describes the persistent but sweetly dull rumor that Equi Church once gave refuge to thieves who never left, or perhaps never truly arrived. He writes, "If this be legend, it is a quiet one, the kind with no heroes, no blood, and no reward. Just survival, stillness, and a soft kind of daring." This is what the brothers became. Not folk heroes, not saints, not even proper villains. Just 2 human figures, blotted into the limestone margins of history, whose greatest act may not have been theft or escape, but the ability to remain so wonderfully, persistently boring. In a world of swords and banners and endless war, they hid underground with crusts of bread, a leaky candle, and straw. No manifestos, no last stands. Just the long patience of the forgotten. And perhaps that's what makes their story linger quietly, like the scent of incense long after Mass has ended. Because the crypt is still there, beneath the church of Ekwe, closed but real. A place that held not treasure, not relics, but the long damp breath of survival. And somewhere, in the soot-stained corners of memory, two figures are still waiting just beneath the floor. The last light of the monastery, the sun has set behind the cloister walls, casting long amber streaks over stone arches and herb gardens. It is the year 1257, and you are in a Benedictine monastery tucked in the hills of northern Italy, far from battle, far from cities, and far from almost everything except silence. At this hour, the monks have finished Compline, the last of the 8 canonical hours of prayer. The bell has tolled. The psalms have been chanted. Feet have padded quietly down the stone halls, sandals worn smooth by repetition. Lamps have been dimmed. The night has officially begun. But here's the question. Did the monks go straight to sleep? We are often told that monastic life was simple, ordered by prayer, fasting, and humble work. And in many ways, it was. But behind the smooth rhythm of monastic hours, an unspoken world lived and breathed. A world of quiet exception, personal habits, and nightly routines that broke the stillness in barely audible ways. Because after there was a kind of grey space of time where the rules were clear, but the living of them was messier. Take the matter of sleep itself. Monks did not sleep in soft beds. They slept in communal dormitory stone rooms with straw mattresses or wooden boards. Each monk allotted only a small space and often no pillow. But they did not sleep for the full night. In most monasteries of the 13th century, the night was split. Monks typically woke in the middle of the night for vigils, around 2 or 3 a.m., so what they practiced was not one long sleep, but a segmented sleep, 2 parts, with a waking period in the middle. This waking period, perhaps 1 to 2 hours long, was where the rules blurred, officially. This time was for quiet reflection, reading sacred texts, silent prayer, or simply lying still and contemplating God. But human nature, even beneath the cowl, finds its own way. Some monks read books they were not supposed to. Not heretical books, just boring ones. Herbal treatises, Roman grammars, old legal documents in Latin that had no real use but soothed the restless mind. These texts were copied over by candlelight, the monk's fingers stained with ink and the sleeves of his robes singed at the edge. Others wandered quietly, of course, into the cloister walk. This was the covered stone path surrounding the central courtyard, lined with arches and gravel. In these hours, the gravel crunched only under the softest sandals, as monks with insomnia or troubled thoughts paced in rhythm with their rosaries. One monk, Brother Aldrich, recorded in his personal notes a rare and unofficial diary that he preferred to recite prayers while walking in the cold air with dew upon the lavender, rather than sitting stiffly in the choir stalls. His abbot chastised him for solitary roaming, but Aldrich defended the practice by citing St. Cuthbert, who also enjoyed walks at night, though that detail was somewhat loosely interpreted. But not all monks spent thereafter hours in spiritual contemplation. Some, particularly the younger novices or the more scholarly-minded, engaged in quiet conversations, whispered exchanges about theological questions, calendar errors, or the practical logistics of composting. Sheep dung. These talks were strictly against the vow of silence, but rarely punished if conducted discreetly and in Latin, in fact. One monastic rulebook from the 12th century even includes a marginal note. If two brothers must converse at night, let it be brief, let it be whispered, and let it concern matters of great boredom. That last line, matters of great boredom, might be the most honest rule ever written. Meanwhile, in the scriptorium, the room where manuscripts were copied, one or two lanterns might still glow after Copland. Copyists sometimes received special permission to continue work late at night, especially if a feast day was approaching or a patron was due a new psalter. These late scribes became a kind of nocturnal caste within the monastic world. They wrote slowly, methodically, often in silence. But one copyist in the monastery of San Severino in 1261 broke the silence with a marginal doodle, a chicken wearing a crown. Another wrote a tired note between verses. My hand is weary, my back cold, and the ink freezes. The nights were cold. Even in summer, stone walls retained the cool of evening. Fires were discouraged, except in the infirmary and kitchen. So most monks huddled in their robes, often sleeping in them to retain warmth. And when the weather turned, the dormitory became a restless sea of coughs, creaking beds, and the occasional scolding whisper from the senior prior. But perhaps most curious is what happened in the herbal rooms, small, tucked-away spaces where medicinal herbs were dried and stored. While officially closed after Copland, these rooms sometimes became unofficial refuges for monks suffering from pain, anxiety, or lingering illness. Brother Lucas, who kept the herbarium at a Franciscan monastery, once noted that he left poppy oil and valerian tea unguarded, but within reach of the Lord's will. In truth, monks suffered from all the ordinary aches of life: toothaches, cold feet, melancholy, indigestion. Their nights were not perfectly ordered affairs of prayer and silence. They were, at times, mundane, uncomfortable, and achingly human. But there's something else. Hidden deep in the rule books and confessional notes are hints that some monks, especially in older, rural monasteries, developed rituals of their own. Quiet habits not sanctioned by the abbey, but passed along like family customs. One monastery in Flanders had a tradition of soaking their feet in warm lavender water before bed. Another would hang bundles of rosemary and sage over the dormitory door to keep night thoughts soft. Perhaps it is no surprise. In a life built around silence and repetition, small rituals mattered. They gave shape to a monk's inner world. And in the hours between compline and vigils, when the world had exhaled and no orders were being given, monks found little ways to feel human again without ever breaking the rule. The night was not an empty stretch between prayers. It was a time of layered routines, private choices, and quiet rebellion, done not in the spirit of disobedience, but in the strange and timeless pursuit of peace. And yet, one wonders, if the vow of silence remained in place, how were these nighttime routines passed down? Who taught the new novices where to walk? What herbs soothed the stomach? Or how many verses to whisper before sleep? Whispers between psalms and the quiet monastic clock. The year is 1257, and the monastery is asleep, or so it seems. If you were to walk silently along the cloister walk of San Michele in northern Italy, just past midnight, you would hear very little: the faint rustle of straw sandals, the soft clink of a bell attached to the infirmary cat, perhaps the quiet murmur of Latin echoing from behind a heavy wooden door. But more than anything, you would notice a rhythm, a slow, invisible timekeeper that governs monastic life. Not a clock as we know it today, but a ritual structure built into the body. For centuries, monasteries operated without mechanical timepieces. Instead, they relied on water clocks, candle clocks, or the natural rhythm of breath, light, and bells. After Compline, the night bell marked the official end of daily duties. But it did not guarantee sleep. Some monks, often older, quieter, and conveniently forgetful, used this time to walk the cloister with their own internal clocks, pacing prayers by the length of a shadow or the number of heartbeats it took to recite Psalm 91. Brother Matteo, a seasoned herbalist with an aversion to early sleep, would keep watch over his garden by starlight. He claimed certain herbs sang differently at night, and though no one knew quite what he meant, he was left to his rituals. The abbot once jokingly called him our nocturnal plant whisperer. Matteo responded by quietly leaving lavender bundles on the abbot's desk each week, always with a page from Ecclesiastes folded inside. Other monks, like Brother Petros, who managed the monastery's wine cellar, had more practical midnight tasks. Vintages had to be checked for mold, especially in humid months. And as with all things monastic, this task became spiritual in its own way. Petros once wrote that he found God in the stillness between the casks. That line ended up in a sermon years later without attribution, of course. But not all nocturnal behavior was sanctioned or poetic in the dormitories. While most monks lay still, others wrestled with more human disturbances: hunger, doubt, and occasionally dreams. That the rule of Saint Benedict didn't have instructions for hunger in particular was common. The evening meal, usually a small effer soup, a bit of bread, maybe beans, was followed by silence until the next morning. No snacks, no exceptions. Yet many monasteries had stories of monks who kept secret crumbs, tiny hidden stores, of dried fruit or stale crust tucked into robe sleeves or under straw pallets. These were not grand rebellions. They were acts of tired stomachs in cold rooms. Monastic rules, especially the Benedictine rule, forbade eating outside the refectory. Yet over time, creative interpretations emerged. Some abbeys allowed a small, medicinal bite if a monk claimed stomach weakness. Others appointed an infirmarian who would quietly distribute warm milk and honey to older monks with unsettled humors. It was, as one prior put it, compassion disguised as compliance. And what of the rule of silence? Technically, speaking was forbidden after Compline, but the enforcement of this rule depended entirely on the monastery. In stricter orders, like the Carthusians, silence was near total. But in Benedictine houses, smaller rural ones, the line blurred. Whispers were tolerated, especially in Latin. Even more so if they involved theology, practical repairs, or the movement of firewood. Whispering about the abbots. Snoring, however, could result in penance. Occasionally, a monk would write instead of speak. Wax tablets were kept in some dormitories for this reason. Simple messages like "I cannot sleep" or "Have you my psalter" were scratched into wax with styluses, then smoothed over by morning. Some messages became jokes. In one abbey, a senior monk once left the message, "The prior dreams in Gregorian chant." No one ever admitted to writing it. The night between Compline and vigils became a quiet theater of small personal behaviors. One monk might mend his robe by lantern light. Another would rearrange his prayer stones. Another still would count ceiling beams to fall asleep. A medieval version of counting sheep. And then there were the scribes, in one Cluniac abbey. Scribes were granted, after Compline leave, permission to stay up past the final prayers, for the sake of completing manuscripts. It was a tedious job, made harder by dim light and cold fingers. Still, Scribes often preferred the night. There was less noise, less pressure, fewer chances of being interrupted by someone needing help with a broken water channel or a missing goat. It's from their margins, their sleepy doodles and casual footnotes, that we know so much of this hidden monastic world. A famous scribal note from 1274 reads, "I write, and I freeze. The ink clots. I sigh. The rooster mocks me still." That single line tells more about medieval monastic nights than most formal chronicles. We also learn from confession records documents not meant to be preserved, but occasionally copied by curious priors. In them, we find evidence of whispered conversations, illicit chess games using carved pebbles, and one monk who confessed to borrowing a candle end for fear of dreaming demons. He was sentenced to 3 days of silent work in the garden. The next week, more monks reported candle dreams. Perhaps the most revealing habit involved private prayer, stone-smooth river stones kept in sleeves or under pillows, sometimes engraved with a letter or symbol. These stones were pressed between fingers during prayer, a tactile way of staying focused. But they were also a comfort, something to hold in the long stretches of darkness when even psalms could not quiet the mind. Monastic life was structured, yes, but not immune to the quiet improvisations of human routine. These were men who had surrendered the world, but not their humanness. And still, we must ask, if the monks bent the rules slightly at night, whispered, wandered, even snack did this weaken their devotion, or simply reflect a deeper kind of faith, one shaped not by rigid obedience, but by quiet endurance. Where the rule ends and the lantern flickers by the early 1300s, the monastery of San Michel had weathered 3 abbots, 2 floods, and one unfortunate incident with improperly stored lentils. Yet its rhythms remained the same. Lauds before sunrise, psalms at intervals, the predictable turning of bells and shadows, and the cloister at twilight turning gold. But the after-compline hours, those soft, watchful hours between official duties, had evolved into their own kind of tradition, unwritten, unrecorded yet, quietly passed along from novice to elder like a thumbed prayer bead. For Brother Tadeo, this was the time for parchment sorting. He would rise when the moonlight hit the edge of his cot, wrap himself in a sheepskin, and shuffle down to the scriptorium where the draft manuscripts lived. Most of them were dull, repetitions of older texts, miscopied verses, sermon fragments. But that was precisely what soothed him. The monotony, the calm absurdity of finding 3 identical sermons titled "The Proper Use of Lentils in Lent" in different handwriting. For Brother Anselm, after Compline was the hour of ink-making. He maintained the monastery's ink, Storzoak gall, ink, wine-based ink, and once, disastrously, a beetroot mix that turned all margins pink for a season. He claimed that the silence made the ingredients more obedient, that even the vinegar curled into itself better after dark. Even Brother Umberto, the cook, would sometimes return to the kitchen, not to cook, but to check on the bread starter. He had named it Benedictus. A living being, he said, deserved late-night company. The yeast was 12 years old and smelled faintly of figs and sermons. But what of the monks who did none of this? What of the ones who simply lay awake? There were many. The human body, even trained by monastic routine, doesn't always comply. Insomnia existed long before blue light. Some monks struggled. Others simply drifted in and out of half-sleep, wrapped in their habits, mouthing memorized psalms to pass the hours. Some used memory journeys, a technique still taught in some monasteries today. A monk would imagine walking through the abbey room by room, naming objects, faces, and holy relics in detail. Others repeated lists, names of apostles, kings of Israel, ingredients in poultices, or obscure Latin verbs. There's evidence that monks shared these techniques in secret, like recipes. A scribbled note in the margin of a psalter reads, "If sleep escapes, repeat names of angels in order: Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, Michael, until peace arrives." Some monks found peace not in lists or prayer, but in sound. The night sounds of a monastery were often deeply familiar creaking beams, the hoot of an owl in the cloister garden, the wind weaving through the belfry. But to the insomniac monk, these sounds were not just background, they were company, a kind of ambient chant. In fact, there were rumors, quiet, respectful rumors, that some monks composed unofficial chants based on these night sounds. One Dominican friar once described the owl psalm, a melodic hum built from the call of a single bird, passed quietly from voice to voice beneath straw blankets. Not every abbot approved of these habits. Of course, some cracked down, requiring stricter observance of silence, removing writing tablets from dormitories, even introducing night walk inspections. But the monastic system was ancient, and like all ancient systems, it bent under pressure instead of breaking. And occasionally, it winked. Take, for example, the story of Abbot Ronaldo, who insisted on absolute silence after Compline one night. As he inspected the dormitory, he tripped over a monk who had fallen asleep while counting stones on the floor. The abbot said nothing, stood, brushed himself off, and returned to his room. The next morning, he gave a sermon on the value of humility and the inevitability of small rocks. Or, consider the Book of Gentle Misuses, an unofficial document kept hidden behind the monastery's apothecary jars. It catalogued harmless rule-bending, like using communion wafers as toothache soothers, or slipping into the library to smell the oldest books when feeling low. These misuses were rarely punished. In fact, many senior monks saw them as signs of resilience, a quiet negotiation between body, soul, and stone. Because despite appearances, the monastic night was not just absence. It was not a void between bells. It was a world of its own, a world where monks carved rosary beads by moonlight, or rearranged garden tools for the morning's work, where quiet laughter occasionally cracked the silence, and guilt was followed by whispered forgiveness, where even the most devout occasionally nibbled on leftover cheese and asked God to forgive their stomach first. Perhaps that is what made the cloister so human, not its rules, but the way those rules were lived, stretched, soothed, and honored. In odd little ways, in this light, the monastic night becomes not just a time of rest, but a meditation, a long, low breath drawn across the centuries, a reminder that discipline and gentleness can coexist, that holiness does not demand perfection, only presence. And maybe that is the true secret of the cloister after Compline. Not scandal, not sin, but quiet endurance, the kind that keeps the world turning while it sleeps. Why the spindle was mightier than the sword. You may not associate medieval nuns with power, but power comes in many forms. In the 12th and 13th centuries, it often came in the form of wool thread, finely spun, carefully woven, and quietly sold at markets 100 miles away under someone else's name. While kings plotted crusades and monks copied scriptures, a quieter revolution hummed behind convent walls, one driven not by swords or sermons, but by spindle and loom. Let's step into the cloister of Saint Scholastica's priory, nestled in the misty valleys of central France. Sometime around the year 1170, the stone walls are worn, the herb garden overgrown in patches, but the workrooms are alive with motion. A dozen women, habits rolled to the elbows, pull raw wool through combs, beat flax, stir dye pots, and spin thread with practiced hands. A novice kneels beside a cracked basin, rinsing yarn in vinegar to fix the color. Behind her, the prioress is hunched over a ledger, whispering Latin numbers to herself. This is not idleness. This is enterprise. Contrary to the popular image of secluded and passive piety, many medieval nunneries were economic hubs, particularly those in rural or border regions, while male monasteries often received royal patronage and vast land grants. Convents had to be more creative, especially those that took in women without noble dowries. So they made things, useful things, lucrative things. Wool was queen. The English Cistercian nuns of Swine and Wothorpe became well known for their sturdy woolens. In Flanders, convents ran full-scale weaving operations, spinning fleece from sheep raised on land and producing cloth sold to merchants in Bruges or Ghent. Unlike the monks, who wrote about the economy in treatises, the nuns lived it. They negotiated with shepherds, dealt with tax collectors, haggled with dyers over indigo prices, and sometimes smuggled a bit of excess thread into market under a cousin's name too. Avoid diocesan oversight. Not exactly legal, certainly not blessed, but quietly tolerated, especially when the profits kept the convent roof from collapsing. There are records from a German Benedictine house that list income from linen of fine make, wool of tight twist, and soap of mild odor. Another convent in Umbria specialized in beeswax candles, exporting them to neighboring towns for cathedral services. Their accounts include line items for cart maintenance, loose donkeys, and one mysterious entry, paid to Bartolomeo for silence. Silence, it seems, was another tradable good, but spinning wool and weaving linen were only part of the story. Some convents became medical centers, especially in plague years. Their herbal remedies, often dismissed by male physicians, were effective, enough to draw pilgrims and coins. Recipes passed from nun to nun included treatments for everything from fevers to melancholy of the womb. And this, unfortunately, is where suspicion began to creep in. The same women who could balance ledgers and produce dye from lichen were also believed to hold knowledge unsuitable to the cloister. This was not always a compliment, as early as the 1100s, certain nuns gained reputations for supernatural insight. Some of this was deserved visions, prophecies, and dream interpretations were encouraged in some orders. But some of it was projection. The outside world, especially male clerics, struggled to explain how unassuming women in plain habits could generate revenue, administer estates, or correctly predict the date of the next frost. In Spain, the abbess of a Visigothic convent was accused of using wool charms to influence the weather. In Germany, a nun in Mainz was briefly imprisoned for spinning sickness into a neighbor's cows, though in reality, she had simply advised the farmer to stop overfeeding them bread scraps. Still, the overlap between economics and suspicion was real. Nunneries that did well were envied. Their prosperity raised questions. Their knowledge of herbs, bleeding, and childbirth opened the door to whispered accusations of maleficium, harmful magic. And so, a convent's success could become a liability. This tension produced a unique kind of cunning. Nuns developed female-led supply chains, They relied on sympathetic tradesmen, loyal relatives, or even local widows to handle distribution. Convent-made linen might show up in the market under a cloth merchant's banner, but the profits still found their way back to the abbess's accounts. One surviving letter from a 13th century French nun reads, "The wool is marked with our sin, yet sells as peers. So God keeps the books, and peer keeps quiet." This was faith. This was survival. And through all of it, daily life continued. The bells rang. Psalms were sung. Hands were blistered, pricked, stained. Young novices whispered jokes while carding wool. Elder sisters read aloud from saints' lives while sewing carsacks for local priests. The sacred and the mundane blurred, as they always did. You can almost hear the spindle humming. You can almost see the quiet satisfaction on the prioress's face as she closes the ledger, her abbey solvent for another season, her sisters warm through another winter. And yet, one must wonder, did the line between blessing and bargaining ever truly disappear? When the convent's fortunes rose while nearby villagers struggled, when a nun's remedies worked better than the doctor's, when a woman's hand moved more coin than any priest's sermon, was it faith, craft, or something stranger? Was it economy or quiet enchantment? Ledgers, herbs, and the line between skill and sorcery. By the early 14th century, the nuns of Central and Western Europe had established themselves not just as religious figures, but as practical forces in their local economies. While monks copied, Aristotle and bishops schemed over beneficers. The nuns of St. Odelia's, abbey located in the damp foothills of Alsace, were doing something far more useful. They were inventing furniture polish. You wouldn't think that sandalwood oil, beeswax, and vinegar could form a credible business model, but these women did. And they were not alone. From the convents of England to the hilltop abbeys of Umbria, nuns operated quiet microeconomies. They handled textiles, remedies, writing, teaching, and even estate management. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of persistence. You could even call it an economy of survival. Let's pause with Abbess Hedwig, a determined woman of Saxon nobility who ran her convent like a duchy. She balanced books. She knew the yield of every flax field and the exact cost of sending wool. To the weavers of Naumburg, her sisters trusted her. The local peasants feared her tax records more than the bishop's sermons. Her greatest asset, a deep understanding of trust. Not just spiritual trust, but credit. Hedwig once allowed a dying merchant to leave her convent 10 crates of pepper as collateral for his soul. Pepper, in the 1300s, was like gold, dust rare, pungent, and instantly saleable. She didn't bless him. She didn't condemn him. She simply signed a ledger and said a prayer for his pancreas. The convent survived 2 poor harvests because of that pepper. But trust could be dangerous. 2. Convent records, when they survive, reveal a world in which financial activity operated under the veil of piety, but required serious administrative muscle. Nuns kept coded ledgers, used saints' feast days as due dates, and occasionally corrected the books in their favor using extremely creative Latin abbreviations. One line item from a Flemish convent reads simply, Salvator Dio. Non regi, paid to God, not to the king. But as convents grew richer, suspicions followed. Consider the Dominican sisters of Wurzburg. Their remedies were so effective that neighboring villages began referring to their abbey as the sisters' pharmacy. The sisters treated boils, rashes, melancholy, indigestion, even the occasional haunting. And they kept meticulous records and lists, measurements, dates, symptoms, everything but actual outcomes. This precision, oddly enough, did not reassure people. If anything, it made them nervous. Why? Because women were not supposed to know so much. Not about bleeding techniques, not about poisons, certainly not about birth control. Yes, some convents quietly passed on recipes to delay conceptionist to widows or poor mothers. The church disapproved, but rarely interfered, especially when those same nuns were caring for plague victims no one else would touch. But this knowledge, however useful, hovered at the edge of sorcery. In 1326, a small convent in Brabant was raided after a midwife claimed to have learned a moon-binding prayer from a nun. No trial was held, but 2 sisters were transferred to different abbeys, and their herb garden was destroyed. It became common during this period for nuns to distance themselves from certain practices. Remedies were relabeled as saints' cures. Spinning charms became psalm patterns. Magical symbols were replaced with crosses, though the rituals remained largely unchanged. And yet, despite the dangers, the work continued. A nun in Aragon wrote in her journal, "We are watched, let them watch. We bind no demons, only wounds." Still, there were more subtle forms of magic in these cloisters, economic ones. A convent in southern England created its own internal currency using small lead tokens marked with saints' initials. These were not used outside the cloister, but helped track work, distribute communal goods, and teach novices arithmetic. The bishop protested. The nuns politely ignored him. In the convent of St. Marguerite, nuns embroidered code words into their linens, supposedly prayers, but some scholars believe they were inventory notations. One cloth bears a stitched message reading, "Anna keeps 2. Elspeth owes 5. The wool is hidden under wheat." Some convents even entered the realm of book production, usually reserved for monks. But a few determined abbesses hired lay scribes, taught their sisters calligraphy, and produced psalters for wealthy patrons. Their handiwork was fine, the margins filled with floral patterns and small grinning animals, cats, rabbits, snails, riding horses. Did those tiny illustrations mean something? A joke, a code, a warning? It's hard to say. What's clearer is this: the economic lives of medieval nuns were never just about survival. They were about quiet authority, about community resilience, about using what tools they had: thread, herbs, ledgers, stories to shape the world just slightly in their favor. They were watched, judged, occasionally punished, but they endured. They endured through floods and famine, papal edicts and local scandals, through inspections and reassignments, through plagues and betrayals and endless winter mornings when the sheep wouldn't come down from the hills. Still, the loom was oiled, the spindle turned, the accounts were updated in the margins of worn Bibles. But if they were not witches, if their power was not supernatural, then how did they hold such quiet sway? How did so many convents thrive while others crumbled? What was it? Luck, skill, faith, or something whispered into the wool as it was spun? The last ledger and the legacy of the Lumit is now the year 1381, and we find ourselves in the chill of early spring, standing at the gates of the Abbey of Saint Euphrasyne. Deep in the wooded valleys of Bohemia, snow still clings to the stones. Crows wheel overhead, and inside the convent walls, silence reigns, punctuated only by the gentle rhythm of wool being spun, the crackle of birch logs on the hearth, and the occasional groan of a wooden chest being shifted across the stone floor. The abbess, Sister Margareta is nearing the end of her life. She has outlived 3 bishops, 1 plague, and countless audits from curious church officials. Her joints ache, but her mind remains sharp. In her lap is a thick, cracked leather ledger, her life's work, not a register of sins or saints, but of debts, credits, donations, orders, and deliveries. And in the margins, notes, quiet traces of rebellion, affection, gossip, and insight. Brother Simon paid in rye. Unacceptable but forgivable. Cloth for Lady Radka sent via her maid. God bless her discretion. Beware the new bishop. Smiles too much. It is not theology, but it is truth. Her truth. Over the years, Sister Margareta and her nuns built more than just cloth or candles. They built a network, a web of trust and quiet trade woven through fields, towns, and even across borders. Bakers, shepherds, merchants, widows, even a Jewish dyer from Praguch played their part. In a time when women's roles were tightly restricted, these nuns carved out authority not by opposing power, but by redirecting it, turning silence into strategy. But eventually, the world caught up. In the late 14th century, reform swept across the church. New bishops, suspicious of what they called worldly habits, cracked down on nunneries that handled too much money or too much medicine. Convents were forced to close their books, disband their herbal clinics, and refocus on prayer and poverty. Some obeyed. Others adapted. A small convent in Bavaria, unable to sell its candles publicly anymore, began donating them to cathedral rectors in exchange for generous blessings. Another abbey, barred from trading linen, simply loaned looms to nearby widows who returned the favor in wool. The records from these years become sparse, deliberately vague, a kind of historical vanishing act. But in the fabric itself, in the surviving garments, altar cloths, and embroidered hemsey, can still trace the hands of these women, patterns unique to their abbeys. Thread spun tighter than necessary, dyes blended in secret recipes. They left their marks, hidden but permanent. And what about the suspicions of witchcraft? As the early 15th century approached, tensions intensified. The line between herbalist and heretic blurred dangerously. Inquisitors looked more closely at convents, especially those known for healing or independent wealth. One abbey in Aragon was dissolved entirely. Another in Lorraine was absorbed by a male monastery, its nuns dispersed for the sake of order. Yet most escaped unscathed, not because they were innocent, whatever that means, but because they were needed. No one else tended the sick with such patience. No one else made wool cloth that warm. And in the depths of winter, no bishop dared alienate the only women who knew how to make a reliable cough tonic. So the nun economists continued, not loudly, but with care. They made their own paper when supplies ran short. They bred bees for wax and for mead. They copied prayers on one side of the parchment and budgets on the other. They trained their novices not just in psalmody, but in accounting, spinning, and medicinal chemistry. By the 1450s, convent economies had changed. Some had shrunk under reform. Others had gone underground. But a few, especially in places like southern Italy and Poland, flourished anew, reinventing themselves as retreat centers for noble women or as private schools for merchant daughters. In each case, the loom remained not just as a tool, but as a symbol. It represented the delicate balance the nuns struck between devotion and pragmatism, between silence and commerce, between suspicion and respect. And as Sister Margareta closed her final ledger for the last time, She didn't leave behind miracles or scandals or bold reforms. She left behind warm clothing, healed villagers, literate girls, and a balance sheet in the black. Centuries later, that ledger would be found in the abbey's ruined library, tucked between a hymnal and a jar of dried thyme. The ink had faded. The entries were simple, but the legacy was unmistakable. It wasn't magic that kept the convent alive. It was competence and wool. The hidden door, the poacher's circle, and the forest's final secret. By late spring of 1291, Bogdan had grown quieter in his patrols. It wasn't just age or weariness. It was the sense that rare creeping instinct, known only to those who spend their lives walking the same woods, that something in the forest had changed. Subtle shifts. Birds no longer nested in certain glades. Mushrooms bloomed where they hadn't before, and occasionally, on windless days, the air near the stone doorway hummed faintly, not loud, just enough to make the hairs on one's arm pause. Still, the snare traps continued, more frequent now, and more cleverly placed. Always near the ridgeline, always inside the zone claimed by Count Ferenspot, with enough deniability that no steward would risk marching Saxons to war over it. The local politics were delicate. Nobles argued, priests muttered. Bogdan simply walked, observed, recorded, until one day, he didn't walk alone. While inspecting an oak tree with a marked notch one he hadn't cut, he heard the unmistakable sound of another set of boots behind him. He turned. Slowly a man stepped forward, wearing a dull grey hood, broad shoulders, unshaven, no crest. "Watcher," the man said, using the old term for a forest guard. "You've seen the door." Bogdan didn't answer. The man didn't seem offended. "It opens," he continued. "Not always, only when the root bell rings." That phrase meant nothing to Bogdan. He knew bells, church bells, cattle bells, shepherd's chimes. But roots, trees, "You're one of them?" Bogdan asked. The man shrugged. "One of many." Then he gestured to a tree nearby, a yew, gnarled and ancient. At its base, partially hidden under moss, was a symbol carved into the bark. The same 3 lines crossed by one vertical he had seen near the door. The man stepped closer. This place was protected once, long before lords, before taxes, before you wrote reports in charcoal on birch bark. He didn't sound angry, just tired. Bogdan studied him. No sword, no bow, just a staff and a pouch at his belt. He looked like a monk, but moved like a hunter. "Why the snares?" Bogdan finally asked. "To keep out the ones who would dig," the man said. "Some things under this forest should not be disturbed. Gold draws fools, but roots remember." The man offered him a small object, a bone token carved with a rune. "For when you pass the door again." Then he turned and walked into the trees, vanishing with a grace Bogdan would have envied in his youth. For the next week, Bogdan resumed his rounds, but he avoided the glade. He wrote no report. He told no steward until the day the wind changed, and the valley filled with smoke, fire real, roaring, and fast driven by a dry spring and high winds. A blaze had started in the far southern woods, likely from a traveler's camp. It raced through underbrush and old timber like a horse set loose. Bogdan and other forest guards gathered buckets, shovels, wet sacks, everything. Villagers came too, shouting, coughing, hauling goats and children. The fire spread, but when it reached the glade near the stone doorway, something happened. It stopped, not slowed. not turned, stopped. As if a line had been drawn. The air there felt cooler, even sweet. A circle of untouched ground lay around the glade, the trees unharmed. Birds even chirped. Later, when the fire was finally beaten back 3 days, to Barnes, lost, and one guard dead Bogdan returned alone to the glade. The doorway stood there, silent, but this time, open, only a crack dot inside, cool air, smelling of damp earth and elderflower faint echoes. He stepped forward, holding the bone token in one hand. But he did not enter. Instead, he removed his old guard's satcheletters, reports, charcoal stubs and laid it beside the stone. Then he turned away and walked back to his trail. A week later, he resigned. Left a note with the steward. The ridge watches itself now. Send no one. Toma, the dog, went with him. No one saw Bogdan again in the royal woods. But sometimes, near the yew glade, travelers claimed to hear a whistle in the leaves. Not a bird, not wind, a man's tune, off-key, but content. Border trees, shadow paths, and the watchers burdened by the winter of 1290. Bogdan had grown used to the rhythm of the forest, its quiet politics, its laws unspoken and spoken alike. He had seen deer rut beneath a waning moon, heard wolves argue across valleys, and even once startled a group of traveling monks bathing in a hot spring. Yet, despite it all, he remained largely invisible. A man of the margins, paid poorly, consulted rarely, needed always. But the kingdom was changing. New tensions crept in like mist between the trunks. Nobles began fencing off parts of the royal woods, laying claims over old commons and forgotten glades. Where once Bogdan had walked freely, now he was expected to report any peasant gathering firewood, even when the firewood had stood dead for a decade. Lords were greedy, bureaucrats were clumsy, and the forest, as always, listened. The year's first heavy snow fell early. Toma, the dog, was older now, less eager to patrol. He often lagged behind, curling into piles of dry leaves and watching birds with a disinterested eye. Bogdan didn't blame him. His own knees had begun to ache when the wind turned, and he was convinced his left boot would not survive another thaw. Still, there was one route he never skipped, the border path. It ran along a ridge of high stone, separating the lands of Count Ferenz and the southern Saxon settlers who had recently claimed territory farther down the valley. The trees along this path were ancient, twisted things, beech and hornbeam, their roots like arthritic fingers gripping the slope. This was a delicate stretch of land, politically speaking, and Bogdan, for all his scruff and solitude, understood it deeply. Here mushrooms grew richer. Soil was damp but firm, and the trees bore strange markings, not his own runes, but deeper cuts, old and overgrown. Some resembled letters, others symbols he could not place. He asked the monks once, and they offered only a shrug, old Slavic charms, or perhaps Dacian, or perhaps nothing, typical monk answer. Still, he walked the ridge weekly, watching for trouble. One morning, he found it. A Saxon trapper had built a shelter just over the boundary line, a crude hut of fir branches and cloth, set low between two elder trees. Next to it, 5 snares had been set. 2 had caught hare. 1 had caught a fox. The trapper, young, soot-faced, nervous, claimed ignorance. Bogdan gave him a choice. Leave now or face the Count's steward, who was known to carry a thumbscrew for just such meetings. The boy left, fast. But that wasn't the end of it. Later, that month, 2 more traps appeared, farther in. Bogdan dismantled them. The next week, a snare line, carefully hidden under moss, ran nearly 30 paces. This one was professional. He began leaving marked stones, a code known only to forest guards. Warnings that the land was under watch, and yet the traps returned. So one morning before dawn, Bogdan took shelter in a hollowed ash tree near the ridge and waited. Hours passed. A jay scolded. Squirrels bickered. Then, just before noon, he heard soft movement. Not the clumsy rustle of an amateur trapper, but a measured, careful approach. A man in dark wool, no crest, no visible weapon. He crouched by a snare, checked the bait, and moved on. Bogdan followed silently. The man never turned. He walked deeper into the wood past a stand of yew trees, into the very glade where Bogdan had once found that strange stone doorway the year before. And there it was again, still half buried, still silent. But this time, someone had cleared the snow around it, laid herbs by its base, and beside the door, marked into the stone, was a fresh, simple 3 horizontal lines, crossed by 1 vertical dot. Not church, not crown. Bogdan stayed long. Enough to remember the mark. He would not return that month. Instead, he widened his patrol, circling toward the old ironstone mine abandoned for decades. He knew rumors of smugglers hiding goods in such places, and he'd heard an old tale once from a toothless beekeeper about a silent trade that happened under new moons in the deepest forest glens. Could it be tied to that door? Or were the woods simply playing tricks on a man who walked too much and slept too little? For all his certainty about poachers and trees and fungus, Bogdan did not pretend to understand everything the forest held. But one thing was clear. This was no longer just about hunting laws or boundary lines. Something older was stirring beneath the roots, and the line between watcher and witness was beginning to blur. Boots, blisters, and beech trees. The life of a woodland minute is late autumn in the year 1289, somewhere near the foothills of the Carpathian Mountains. The first frost has just touched the birch bark, and a narrow trail winds through the dense forest canopy of what is now western Romania. If you follow that trail long enough, you will find a man asleep in a pile of moss and pine needles. His name is Bogdan, and he is one of the least respected but most necessary men in the Kingdom of Hungary, a forest guard. Forest guards were neither knights nor peasants. They occupied a curious space in medieval societies with authority, given permission to roam freely in royal woods and noble preserves, yet often ignored in court or mocked in taverns. But their job was essential: to monitor game, deter poachers, prevent illegal timbering, and occasionally drag a grumbling offender before the village reeve. Bogdan's gear was simple: a rough woolen tunic, already going threadbare at the elbows, a patched pair of boots, waterproofed with pig fat and pine sap, a crooked staff part walking aid, part bludgeon, a horn to signal trouble, a small knife, mostly used for cheese, and a wax-sealed letter of authority, stamped by the local count. His office was 40 miles of forest. His only regular colleague, a dog named Toma, who was unusually good at sniffing out deer trails and unusually bad at staying awake. Being a forest guard meant walking. A lot of walking. Bogdan walked in sun and sleet, under starlight and fog, through mud that swallowed boots and over ridges so steep that even goats hesitated. He walked because patrols were expected, because footprints mattered, because the silence of the woods could change too quickly if left unwatched. Most days were quiet. He'd pass a charcoal burner's hut and wave. He might sit with a traveling monk and share boiled lentils. Sometimes he'd nap beneath a beech tree and dream of sausage. But occasionally, something would disturb the rhythm. A rustle, a broken branch, a snare set too well to be innocent. Poachers, in 13th century Balkan forests, hunting without permission was both common and illegal. Deer, boar, harivan, birds were often considered noble property, especially near game parks or lands claimed by abbeys and counts. But the poor still needed to eat, so they trapped quietly, cautiously, under brush and in silence. Bogdan didn't always arrest them. Often he didn't even speak. He would break the trap, leave a warning, token a bent twig in a circle and keep walking. But sometimes the poachers were bolder. A small group of brothers, notorious near the Danube frontier, once tried to pass themselves off as firewood traders. Bogdan caught them with a dead stag hidden under a wagon full of branches. He confiscated the cart, wrote a report in charcoal on birch bark, and dragged the stag back to the watch station, a lean-to with a table and a stubborn mule. Justice, such as it was, depended on which noble claimed the woods. Some were lenient. Others demanded a hand be cut off. Bogdan disliked those nobles. He preferred the ones who paid in bread and allowed his reports to be ignored quietly. But forest work wasn't just about poachers. It was about the trees themselves. Forests in medieval Europe were more than just wilderness. They were regulated zones. Trees could be owned. Cutting down the wrong one could result in a fine or flogging. Bogdan once fined a priest for felling a pear tree on land he didn't technically own. The priest threatened to excommunicate his dog. The dog was unmoved. He also watched for signs of rot and disease, particularly among the beeches and oaks. A single infection could ruin timber meant for castle repairs. Sometimes Bogdan marked trees for future cutting, scoring small runes into the bark with his knife. Other times, he placed small charms folk wards from his grandmother meant to protect the strong and hush the hollow. He wasn't superstitious, but he wasn't careless either. His most feared enemy wasn't a poacher or a wolf, but fire. A single spark in summer could destroy a swath of forest overnight. One year, lightning struck an old ash tree, and flames spread for miles. Bogdan, Toma, and 3 other guards spent 2 days digging trenches and beating flames with wet cloaks. He lost his boots that week and a chunk of his beard, but saved the eastern grove. No medal followed. Just a larger ration of millet and a nod from the steward. And so his days passed. Patrol, sleep, write a report. Chase off boys trying to trap birds. Trade cheese for garlic. Repair a boot with deer sinew. Watch the seasons shift. Spring brought bears and mushrooms. Summer brought bees and barking stags. Autumn meant acorns, dying leaves, and the sound of axes far off, some legal, some not. Winter brought stillness, and occasionally snow that swallowed his knees and silenced even the dog. But one winter, he found something strange. A stone doorway, half buried in ivy and snow, tucked behind a stand of silent yew trees. It was too small for a chapel, too wide for a tomb. No markings, no footprints, no animals, just a dry, whispering breeze that seemed to come from within. He did not enter. He built a cairn beside it, made a note in his report, then walked away. But he could not forget it. The woods, were not empty. They remembered, just as he did. Centuries later, no one may remember the details. Bogdan's name never made it into any royal records. And the stone doorway where he once left his watch behind, it's likely buried now beneath tree roots. Or perhaps still standing silently, waiting for eyes that know where to look. But there was a time in the hushed forests of the medieval Balkans when one man mattered more than any war, king, or cathedral bell. A man who walked daily beneath the shadows of trees, who could read a rabbit snare like a letter, who could see a notch on bark and know that a new story was about to begin. Men like Bogdan never won great battles. They didn't build kingdoms, but they understood the woods. They read silence, and they kept watch over paths the rest of the world never knew existed. We may not remember them, but perhaps the forest still does.